So a little bit of a throwback to high school biology. This is the process of evolution right here. 3 steps. We've got variation, selection, and retention. The first part is variation. Again, this is at the genetic level. So changes in your DNA sequence leads to phenotypic differences, different height, different color, different shapes of organisms and stuff like that. Your DNA changes how you look, other kind of features of the organism. And certain of those variations are then selected to for their benefits, right? So there's natural selection, sexual selection, arbitrary selection. Basically, what works, we keep what works, and we kind of, whatever doesn't work, gets kind of discarded. So this process favors adaptive or fitness enhancing changes. So it improves the organism's ability to survive and reproduce in its environment. And then we've got retention. So those genes that were selected are then passed off into the offspring, and your gene frequency increases in subsequent generations. And this is what was considered the old definition of evolution. Frequency increases in genes and alleles within the organism. So that's biological evolution. Happens over multiple generations, and that's how we've gotten to have like the wonderful panoply of creatures inhabiting the world that we have right now. However, evolution is not just at the biological level. Scientific advances since the 1970s have led to a broadening in the concept of what we consider inheritance. For example, there's the field of epigenetics, which is a really cool way of seeing how environmental factors that turn genes on and off also affects how they're expressed. So you might have a gene for a certain feature, but that gene might not be turned on because of factors including diet, stress, things like that. And then your epigenetic effects can also be inherited as well. So one generation with certain epigenetic markers can then pass those markers on to subsequent generations. That's why, we have this idea of generational stress, generational trauma. Epigenetic markers can get passed on to subsequent generations. So it's not just that simple biological process. There's also additional mechanisms of inheritance. So B.F. Skinner, right, in his seminal works in the 1950s, he kind of landed on the idea that the processes of operant behavioral selection kind of mirror biological selection. They overlap, and he coined the term operant selection. The idea that, an organism is going to naturally vary its behaviors. Those behaviors are going to differentially contact reinforcement in the environment, and those behaviors that contact higher levels of reinforcement, well, they're going to be retained into the future, right? We know this as behavior analysis. This is basic operant selection. And there's also cultural selection. So in cultural selection, it's social learning models, right? We don't have to just learn from our own experiences. We can also learn from the experiences of others. And it's not just humans who engage in cultural streams of inheritance. Other species do as well. Insects, primates, marine mammals, they engage in social learning. There's also symbolic learning. So using language, particularly written language, to communicate information across generations. Now that is a uniquely human trait. And it's kind of become a double-edged sword for human beings. And we'll get into that maybe later on in this presentation. So evolution is typically thought of as a slow process. It takes multiple generations to occur. You don't know exactly what direction it's going to go. And that might be true for biological streams. However, operant and cultural streams of inheritance allow for dramatic developments in rate and scope of adaptation. We know that operant selection happens within the lifespan of the individual organism. You could have operant selection happen within the span of a single session with a client. This powerful process of operant selection is thought to have played a large part in what they call the Cambrian explosion about 540 million years ago, where you got this huge development in the variety of species on the planet. And that is thought to have been a product of operant selection. Species were engaging in new behaviors. Those new behaviors gave you maybe some behavioral cusps, different contexts within the environment, maybe developing new features to then have different interactions with the environment, and the process continues. And then also cultural streams of inheritance, cultural evolution can allow for cooperation at much larger scales across geography and across time. So I could read a book that was written 2,000 years ago in Greece, and suddenly I've got cultural evolution. I can learn those ideas that were written down thousands of years ago, way far away. So there's a quote by this author, Yuval Noah Harari. He wrote the book Sapiens back in 2011. And it says, ever since the cognitive revolution, humans have been able to change the behavior quickly, transmitting new behaviors to future generations without any need of genetic or environmental change. We don't need to wait for the environment, right? So his quote says, the cognitive revolution is accordingly the point when history declared its independence from biology, which is pretty powerful stuff. We don't have to wait eons, thousands of years, hundreds of generations anymore for evolution to happen. We can do it on purpose. We now have available to us processes of intentional evolution, deliberate selection and manipulation of our environment to create niches in fitness space and pass those adaptations on to members of our own and future generations, rather than waiting on the slow and random process of genetic variation through biological evolution. We're not stuck anymore. So now that we can evolve on purpose, it could be argued that's what we should be doing with this great responsibility. With this great power, comes great responsibility. So this idea of evolution accounting for fitness enhancing changes, right? Things that benefit the organism, those get passed down to next generations. So you would think like, okay, we're only getting stuff that benefits the organism. But what about changes that are apparently fitness reducing? Because sometimes we see those. We see an organism engaging in behaviors, or sometimes they develop a feature and you're kind of like thinking, why would they do that? There doesn't seem to be really any benefit to the organism for that adaptation. So now we get into the next level of the evolutionary component of prosocial. This is called multi-level selection theory. Now bear with me, it's a little bit complicated. So back in the 1970s, this genetics researcher, William Muir at Purdue University, he observed natural differences in productivity among the laying hens. And like any good researcher does, he wants to improve productivity. So he's going to think about when the most productive individual hens were selected. Let me back that up a second. So he was wondering how he could improve productivity among the laying hens. So he selected for those hens who were producing more eggs, right? Makes sense. This hen is laying more eggs. They can lay more eggs. If I just choose these hens that lay more eggs, I'm going to have a lot more hens that can lay more eggs, and I'll get more eggs. However, when those most productive individual hens were selected, his productivity declined. He started getting less eggs. And he didn't realize that they were actually selecting for aggression, not productivity. Those chickens that were laying more eggs before, they were doing so because they were bullying the other chickens to outcompete for resources. So then when you get a bunch of those bullying chickens, well, you start getting chickens that look like that picture right there. Not so great. Now, when the most productive groups of chickens were selectively allowed to breed, then the productivity really kicked up. They were intentionally selecting for collaboration now, not just productivity. So those super chickens were initially selected, albeit accidentally, for selfish traits that pitted group members against each other. This is also called within-group selection. And then in the second round, once they figured out their mistake, they then selected for altruistic traits that promoted cooperation among those individual group members. And this is what we call between-group selection, as more cooperative groups win out in competition between less cooperative groups. So this experiment highlights that unrestrained individual selfishness can lead to group suffering. And under natural conditions, there's a tug of war with within-group selection pulling towards self-serving traits and between-group selection pulling toward group-serving traits. It's not always a straight line, like, oh, we're always going to do between-group selection. There's often a back and forth between the two. It took William Muir about 6 generations to breed his super chickens, like in that picture below. And that was through genetic selection, right? Natural, it was actually arbitrary selection because he was choosing which chickens to breed. But it took him 6 generations to do it. With operant selection, though, similar results can be achieved within a single organism's lifetime and transmitted to future generations through cultural selection, with either disastrous or delightful results for the larger group. So here's a quote that kind of sums it up. So on the left, we have E.O. Wilson. On the right, we have David Sloan Wilson, one of the authors of Prosocial. And they said that selfishness beats altruism within groups, altruistic groups beat selfish groups. Everything else is commentary. But this isn't the end of the story, since the world isn't made up of a single group. Between group selection that benefits one group doesn't necessarily eliminate conflict, it just shifts it up to a larger level and makes it potentially more deadly. So you can see, like in that between group slide right there on the right, it's not just that one group in the box. We've got other groups outside of it as well. So now we don't just have a single individual competing with other individuals. We've got groups competing with groups. And it can get a lot deadlier if it's not reined in. So between group selection that benefits one group doesn't eliminate conflict, just shifts it up a level. To solve this problem, we need to add additional layers and shift our understanding of the words individual and group. So we understand selection at between group level promotes altruistic behaviors and benefits the group and the individual. Okay. So let's zoom in at that individual or within group level. From a biological perspective, you're not just an individual person. You're also a group of organs that hopefully are cooperating with each other as part of an altruistic group, which makes up you. Seen this way, the individual person is a product of between group selection at the organism level and suppression of within group selection at the organ level. If selfish traits that benefited the individual organ, in this case the stomach, and it started hogging up resources for its own growth, well, now you've got stomach cancer and a whole lot of suffering at the between group level. You might not survive. So just like with the super chickens, so with our internal organs. Selection at the between group level promotes altruistic behaviors and benefits the group and the individual. The individual person gets to keep on living. The stomach gets to keep on digesting and doing what stomachs do. And just like you are not just an individual person, your stomach isn't just an individual organ. It's a group of organelles as well. And hopefully they're also cooperating with each other as part of an altruistic group, aka a stomach cell and ultimately your stomach. But this isn't always the case. Whoops. So mitochondrial DNA is distinct from nuclear DNA, and it follows its own processes of selection. If traits are selected at this within group level, at the mitochondrial level, it can cause problems at the between group level of the organ. We see this sometimes in plant species, where too many mutations in mitochondrial DNA, right? That mitochondrial DNA gets a little too selfish. It can lead to a condition called cytoplasmic male sterility, where the plant can no longer reproduce. So yeah, sure, you got a selfish mitochondria, but not for long, because then the plant eventually dies off. So hopefully this has illustrated the idea that the term individual doesn't only mean a person. It could also mean an organ or a mitochondria or even a molecule or an atom, right? The chain can keep on going down the ladder to more and more finer level.